Bonsoir tout le monde, Massa al-Khair, on pourrait parler en français, tellement la salle est remplie de francophones, mais puisque la conférence a été prévue en anglais, donc je parlerai en anglais et également notre invité. Your Excellency, the Ambassador of France, Your Excellency, the Ambassadors of all the countries, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for coming to attend this conference organized by the French Research Center of the Arabian Peninsula, the CEFRIPA. It is normally organized in our center in Qasr Dasman and within the framework of our seminar, the CEFRIPA Tuesdays, but considering the interest of the subject and the great quality of our lecturer, who came specially for this occasion, we asked Sheikh Rasha the authorization to use the amphitheater of the National Library of Kuwait. I thank her very much for giving us this beautiful place and for allowing us to welcome many people. I would also like to thank our speaker, Jean-Pierre Filiu, for his availability and interest in coming to visit us. Professor Filiu is Professor of Middle East Studies at Sciences Po, Paris School of International Affairs. He has been visiting professor at the universities of Columbia and Georgetown, and he is known worldwide as one of the best experts on the Middle East. He has written more than 20 books on Arab countries, their political regimes, the 2011 revolutionary process that shook the region, or the problems of violence and human rights. He has been writing a blog on the Middle East for the newspaper Le Monde for several years, and his books have been translated into more than 15 languages, including Arabic, such as The Mirror of Damascus, translated under the title of Mir'at Dimashq, and The Arabs, Their Destiny and Ours, translated under the title of Masir al-Arab wa Masiruna, Tarikh al-Taharrur. I will not dwell on his qualities and his excellent career, but those who are curious could see his biography on the internet, and they will discover, to their surprise, that our guest has other areas of predilection and other passions, and that he has also written books on the rock singer Jimi Hendrix or the flamenco singer Camarón de la Isla. Regarding the Arab world, Professor Filiu knows well this region. He has lived in various countries and has developed close ties with many researchers and academics, politicians, and members of civil society. For this reason, his approach to the most important issues shaking the Middle East is not only the product of an academic research done in an office, but also the result of a deep human experience. This is an important fact that I am emphasizing a great deal. Moreover, unlike many experts on the Middle East, and we know there are many, especially bad ones, Mr. Filiu has a particular way of approaching present issues, linking them to ancient historical roots and taking into account the multiple cultural identities that have shaped the region. This is what he emphasizes in his latest book, published in 2021, which he has titled The Middle of the World, Le Milieu du Monde in French, rather than the American name of Middle East, in order to convey the complexity and depth of the historical and cultural issues that animate this part of the world. Geopolitics is therefore, according to him, inseparable from all the factors that allow it to be explained and enlightened. This choice of approaching the thorny issues of the Middle East by placing them in the long term is a methodological commitment that recalls the French historical schools and their way of approaching history. I am very happy that in front of many Kuwaiti academics present this evening, there is a representative of the French theory or the French school in the field of history and political science. Finally, I would like to remind you that Professor Filiu was also a diplomat for 20 years and that he was involved in the history of the liberation of Kuwait in 1991. I would like to thank him again for coming to speak to us as part of CEFRIPA's research activities and the celebration of 60 years of Franco-Kuwaiti friendship, for which we will also have an exhibition at the end of the month here at the National Library. So I give him the floor for his lecture on the French contribution to liberation of Kuwait. Thank you, Professor Filiu.
So thank you so much, dear Makram. I will try to live up to such an introduction. I hope I won't disappoint anybody, and I want really to thank you all, to thank, of course, Her Excellency, the Ambassador of France, all the dignitaries and friends who are present tonight. And what I will try tonight is something I never did before, but it's a very special evening. I will try to mix my personal experience as a very junior diplomat. I was less than 30-year-old at the time, I'm 60 now, and the greater history of the liberation of your country after the tragedy of the invasion and occupation by Saddam's Iraq. And in order to make this mixing of ذكريات مباشرة وتأمل I will use chronology, because chronology is, at the end of the day, what historians are about. And chronology is very revealing. So first, where did I stand when this crisis occurred? I was a young diplomat. I won't recall my age again, it won't change a lot during the crisis. But I had discovered at 18 Syria, Lebanon, the Palestinians during the summer of 1980. Is it loud enough? Is it okay? Thank you. So maybe I should. Is it better this way?
Yeah.
Okay, sorry. As a former diplomat, I speak loud. I don't speak loud. I speak low. This is something. You know, by the way, it's a diplomatic technique, because when you speak low, people are forced to focus on what you say instead of focusing on what they're supposed to say. This is by the way, President Mitterrand who told me that. So I had great teachers. So. You know, I started in this, I was in Aleppo in 1980, and when you are in Aleppo in 1980, first you understand that the Syrian regime is basically wrong, but if you study a little bit, you understand that there is no good Ba'ath party. The idea that there is a good Ba'ath that could be anti-Iran, and a bad Ba'ath that could be pro-Iran was totally out of my way. Okay, is this okay? Thank you. So, yes, okay. And very early on, I was a delegate for the International Federation of Human Rights in Lebanon and in Palestine. So again, the idea that I met with opponents, and in Lebanon I did such a work that after a while I couldn't stay in Lebanon. My last dwelling was in Bir al-Abed in front of Sheikh Fadlallah's home, because that was the last place I could stay, and because I wrote also about Amal and Hezbollah, I had also to leave this place and could not come back until I was diplomat 10 years later. And I joined the Foreign Affairs, and I was lucky enough for my first posting to be assigned to Amman during the first Intifada on one side, and during the end of the Iraq-Iran war on the other side, with all the emotions and that you can imagine on the East Banker and Palestinian components of the Jordanian population. But when I came back to Paris, I joined our policy planning staff. And in February 1990, I wrote a diplomatic note of perspective about Iraq and what it could mean for Kuwait. And because I had heard that during a meeting of the foreign ministers of the Arab League, Tariq Aziz was sure that the League would condemn the Syrian occupation of Lebanon, and he felt absolutely disappointed in front of Farouk Shara, his Syrian counterpart, when finally the Arab League considered that it was a brotherly presence in Lebanon, not an occupation. And at that moment, Tarek said, if big fish can eat small fish, then other fish will be eaten in the region. And I received that. And I said, what could be the fish in Tarek Aziz's mind? So I wrote this note, and my conclusion was that inevitably Iraqi pressure will be exerted on Kuwait, but because I'm a diplomat, I say probably peacefully. Nobody in his right mind would have, but just adding one and one. And so, as you know, the tragedy of the invasion and occupation of your country occurred in the middle of the summer of 1990, which means that from a diplomatic point of view, there was no ambassador. It was a deputy chief of mission crisis. There were only deputies, including in Kuwait. And I was at that time in Paris with the deputy chief of my center, and I wrote a note in very dramatic terms, something you shouldn't write as a diplomat. In the final moistness of a tragic summer, no border from now on will be sacred in the Middle East. Just to try and raise the ante. But at the same time, very early on, France launched its Salamander operation after the occupation of Kuwait in the Persian Gulf with around 4,000 military. But I was also focusing on the fact that something huge was happening inside the Islamist family, or trend, call it whatever, with a breakup between the Muslim Brotherhood that tried to take a position saying, oh, we are against the invasion and occupation and annexation of Kuwait, but also against Desert Shield at that time. And the crisis that occurred in Saudi Arabia, and the Salafi trend that was privileged from then on by the Saudi regime that turned against the Muslim Brotherhood. Of course, I was curious, but nobody knew at the time that Osama bin Laden had offered his services to Prince Sultan bin Abdulaziz, and he had been rebuked, and that his veterans, that nobody knew they were already Al-Qaeda, would form eventually the Jihadi trend, the third branch of this now divided Islamist family. But what was sure is that I was sad as hell in Paris with all this tragedy taking place, and I was sad because for me, Kuwait, I had never visited Kuwait, but Kuwait was basically, for me, the cradle of Fatah, and was committed to Arab national values. And for me, the idea that in the name of this Arab nationalism, you could invade and annex an independent country was totally out of my mind. And I had very strong and very tough talks, especially with Palestinian friends at that time. And so I said, well, the only way would be to try and get closer. And in those corridors, in those empty corridors of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, one afternoon I met one colleague that was very sad. I said, well, what's happening to you? What's happening to you? They sent me to Kuwait. Yes, they need somebody to Kuwait because, we have now hostages, we have all those people, and we need somebody coming from Paris who wouldn't be on the diplomatic list of the Iraqis, who would be sent from Paris and who could be able, without being on the Kuwaiti list, without being on the Iraqi list. I said, my God, that's me, that's my job, I want to go there. And I phoned the management of and they made me repeat twice, you volunteer for Kuwait now? Yes, volunteer for Kuwait. And I got my Iraqi visa from that time, but the Iraqis thought, which is something that, I have a strange reputation in this part of the world, that I was intelligence. So finally they cancelled the visa. So I say, oh, so I'm stuck in Paris. But of course, this has that caught the attention of certain authorities. You know, there is this guy, he volunteered for Kuwait. And the Minister of Interior, Pierre Joxe, wanted to have with him this guy who volunteered for Kuwait. And so, without having applied for anything, I joined and he was Minister of Interior, and I respected him very much, not only because of his stature, but because, you know, he's a son of Louis Joxe, who negotiated the independence of Algeria, and he was very close to François Mitterrand, but despite his proximity to President Mitterrand, he had the courage to defy him when Mitterrand, after being elected as president, decided to amnesty the generals that were against the independence of Algeria, that were Algérie française, that were in fact coup accomplice. And at that time, Joxe was the leader of the socialist group at the National Assembly, where its majority, decided to vote against, so forced Mitterrand to pass this law against the will of the people of the National Assembly. And this for me was really, you know, I was so proud to join his team. And also, I was very honored by joining him in those circumstances. And you know, when you are at the Interior Ministry, well, you focus on domestic security, and we all knew that there were very active Iraqi networks in France. So, and France, as you know, had been already the target during the previous year of state-sponsored terrorism, Syrian, Iranian, including here in Kuwait in '83, when the French and American embassy were bombed only 5 minutes one after the other by a pro-Iranian network. You know the whole story, and you know how the mastermind of this attack eventually met his death in Baghdad 1 year and a half ago, 2 years ago. So there was this context, and in this context we had hostages, and Saddam Hussein, of course, he was a ruthless dictator, so he couldn't understand the fact that by offering France to give a special treatment to French hostages, he was offending Mitterrand deeply. The idea that you know, you're trading my citizens while the citizens of other countries will be kept as hostages, that was absolutely impossible. And on the top of that, on September 13, 1990, the Iraqi forces stormed the French residency. They also stormed other diplomatic premises, but in the French residency they took 4 hostages, including the military attaché, before releasing him while keeping the other hostages. So this was considered by François Mitterrand as a casus belli, and he made it very clear that from then on, through what would be called the Opération Daguet, he was joining the coalition, but with a very reluctant Minister of Defense, Jean-Pierre Filiu, whose links with Iraq were historical, and whose proximity with Saddam was also pretty ideological. But that's another story. What is important is that there is a tradition in French diplomacy, of course, of national independence, of your own ambition, but when you have a crisis, you try to use the crisis to settle on the long term the issue, not just to close the file, but try to use what we call traité à chaud, which was totally the opposite for the American approach, that you know perfectly. They wanted in Kuwait to open the gates of what they called a new world order, a new post-Soviet order, and in fact, entering the coalition was paying his entry ticket to this new world order. Either you're with us or you're against us. And so François Mitterrand proposed a very ambitious approach at the General Assembly of the UN on September 24. First, Iraq should announce, without any doubt that they were going to withdraw unconditionally from Kuwait, then they should withdraw, restore the sovereignty of Kuwait, and then there should be a third step where, in this new spirit, a peace process would be launched for Lebanon, but also for the Palestinians who were already in the third years of their intifada, peaceful uprising, without any political rising. So, exactly on the contrary of that, James Baker, who is a very talented Secretary of State, and was really representing extremely well the point of view and the interest of his country, was negotiating, as I told you, the entry tickets, especially with Hafez al-Assad, which was the toughest of the lot. The Assad are always the toughest of the lot because they are sitting on their chair, and they are not moving, and they are waiting for the world to turn around until the time is right. And the time was right for Hafez al-Assad. He knew perfectly that the Syrian population was pro-Saddam. But he knew also perfectly that the Syrian population could do nothing about it. So, without, of course, putting it explicitly, he negotiated his participation to the coalition to the fact that he could liquidate the Lebanese resistance. And that was the case in the second month of September, when the Syrian army, after already 14 years of occupation, entered East Beirut and liquidated the Lebanese army resistance with Michel Aoun, the then not only chief of staff but also self-proclaimed prime minister, taking asylum at the French residency, but in Beirut. I have some. I followed then the way we exfiltrated first his family and then himself, but that's another story. What is important is that from then on, we had this Daguet operation that was technically, technically under US operational command, Norman Schwarzkopf, even though officially it was under the command of Khaled Ben Sultan, who was hosting the coalition on Saudi soil. While the coalition was stepping up its efforts on Saudi territory, we had also diplomatic efforts at the UN Security Council, with the Americans pushing, because at that time for them, it was absolutely in this new world order, they wanted to be UN bilateral, not unilateral like we know right now, but to always have the cover of the UN, because and they wanted really to be backed by the Security Council. So they were, trading this and that, and eventually, as you all know, on November 29, after 3 months, they got the prize, which was UN Security Council Resolution 678, that was considering that the use of force was legitimate if Iraq had not evacuated Kuwait by January 15. So at that time, I remember our Minister of Foreign Affairs, Roland Dumas, said to President Mitterrand, "Oh, we voted this resolution because like that, we won our seat to the International Peace Conference after the war." I said to my Minister, Pierre Joxe, "No, wait, we just lost our seat by voting this resolution." That's another debate. I support this resolution 150%. But once the Americans have got the vote, there's absolutely no reason for bringing the French on board. And we will see then at the Madrid Peace Conference that it was a pure US show, but a peace process. And that will be, at the end, it will be a peace process, unfortunately, not a peace. So, despite that, Mitterrand was still hoping for this international peace conference. He was calling it at the beginning of January. So we are really in the countdown before Desert Storm. And in those very critical days, he sent to Baghdad one of his closest friends, Michel Vauzel, who was president of the Foreign Affairs Committee at the National Assembly, so he was not representing the executive branch, but the legislative branch. So the executive power was not dealing with Saddam, but he was former spokesman of the Élysée and very close to Mitterrand, and I discussed in details what happened in Baghdad. Of course, it was chargé d'affaires, the deputy chief of mission, because there was no ambassador who could have come back after that. And he met first Tariq Aziz and then Saddam Hussein on January 5. And Saddam Hussein received him in military fatigues with Kalashnikov on the desk, just to give you the state of mind of the man, and spoke during 4 hours about how the world betrayed him, Kuwait, Iraq, you know all that, all this. And Iraq was supposed to be at the forefront. All this was very depressing. Michel Vauzel understood that there was absolutely no way despite the fact that the countdown was only 10 days now, for Saddam Hussein, that was totally drunk on his own vision, to put it nicely. So Vauzel came back, reported to Mitterrand, who understood that it was over, and as you know, on January 9, there was the last meeting between James Baker and Tariq Aziz, and Tariq Aziz refused to take the letter that James Baker wanted to give him on behalf of his president to his president. And on January 14, because the French diplomat, they never stopped. Until the end, when everyone said so, but no, they still make project draft and all that. So they presented the draft to the UN in 6 points. So 5 first points were about the restoration of the sovereignty of Kuwait, and the 6th one was about an international conference that would be dealing with the Israeli-Arab conflict and the Palestinian question. And of course, this was never voted. And as you know, on January 15, at the end of the countdown, and just few hours before the beginning of Desert Storm, there was 500,000 US soldiers and a coalition of 34 nations, including 12,500 French, who had under their own operational command 4,500 US soldiers. So that was the Daguet operation. And as my friend and colleague who knows me with his presence tonight, we discussed it this morning, Abdallah Al-Hajiri, why the French didn't join more closely the air strikes that started, as you know, on January 17 on this part of the world, on January 16 on the other side of the world. Why didn't? Because the Americans were choosing the targets, and the French didn't want the targets to be assigned to them. And if I may say, rightly so, because after less than 1 month, there was a tragedy of the shelter at Amiria, where hundreds of civilians were killed in the US bombing. Of course, this was all the responsibility of Saddam Hussein. I don't deny that. And he used them as a human shield. By the way, he had used this expression several times. But in order to have this propaganda around, so the French had their own independence of admitting these targets or not targets. But, of course, when it came to land operation, and you know that would be the next step, we were assigned a sector, the Salman sector, by the Americans. And this sector was supposed, through our intelligence and the US intelligence, to be ripe with chemical weapons. So that was the mood. And on France joined the strikes, he joined the strikes on the presidential guard, on military targets, and that was too much for Jean-Pierre Filiu, who resigned. By the way, he had resigned months ago, but Mitterrand had refused to accept his resignation because he didn't want to bow to outside pressures. And he decided to replace him with Pierre Joxe. And Pierre Joxe was kind enough to bring me on the other bank of the Seine, because you know the Interior Ministry is close to the Élysée, while the Ministry of Defense is on the left bank. So I joined with him, and he trusted me on that. And he trusted me despite the fact that I was, as you may have noticed, I'm quite explicit in my beliefs. And I said very clearly, once we start this war, we have to get the head of Saddam. You know, waging this war without getting rid of Saddam will be only a job I've done. But it's impossible. You are an extremist. But at the same time, okay, we will keep you because we know you have this kind of thoughts that are not exactly mainstream. Because I had my remarks about the war proper, but the moment you start with a monster like Saddam, you have to get rid of it. This is it. And you know it wouldn't be the case. So, imagine arriving at the Ministry of Defense in the middle of a war that had already started. That's quite, and being a very young diplomat as I was, but at the same time, you know, being brought to several meetings, you know, with Prince Sultan and others as you know, advisors and maybe translators was quite an experience. But on February 14, after meetings in Paris, you know, Joxe felt it was time for him to go over there, and what was very important for him, crucial for him, to go and meet Emir Jaber. You know, that was, of course, he had to go and see the Daguet operation, our people, but he really wanted to go to Taif and to meet the head of state, and to tell him, as a personal message of François Mitterrand to him, how France was totally, absolutely committed to the restoration of the sovereignty of Kuwait. So we went there, it was at night, it was all very spectacular, because you know, Taif is in the mountain, you go over there, it's a winding road, and you are over there, and there's this palace, and this royalty in exile, literally, and this also impressed me a lot. But what impressed me probably even more, if I may say, is that since we had those intelligence about the possible use of chemical weapons, you have to, and I know the Kuwaitis know that, but not the others, that we all had gas masks on our beds, and we had been trained to put them, take them off, put them, take them off, and those if you had no gas mask, it was not even conceivable to land in this, and in what was already a war zone, even though it was only an air war, but still, you had Scud missiles being fired at Saudi territory, you could hear the sirens, and there was a quote in one of those mornings with the minister. Saddam, as you know, was also trying to drag Israel to the war by bombing Israel and Palestine, by the way, absolutely blindly. But the Americans were very, very, very adamant, and for the first time in Israeli history, Israel was not allowed to retaliate after a strike on its own territory. So I was very impressed because this is not a secret that I'm revealing, but we were, and you know, waging war is planning for war before waging it directly. We considered that there was a possibility of up to 10% of casualties because of the sector we were assigned by there. So I remember this warehouse on the KBS airbase where all of the body bags were it's very impressive. And I know that, okay, we say, yes, now it's a clean war, we're bombing, but after that it will be, you know, the land offensive. And just an anecdote with Pierre Joxe, the chief of staff of our land army at that time, and a journalist of Le Monde, who went to the border, who didn't cross into Iraq, but went to the very border in order to see where we were going to attack. And because the journalist from Le Monde was taking notes, which was, of course he was there, but it was off, and the general, I won't say it's easy to find his name, but I won't say his name now, he started throwing stones at me. And I received stones, so imagine, you have your gas mask, you have a 4-star general throwing stones at you, you are in the middle of nowhere, and you know, and I said, my general, why are you throwing stones at me? The journalist, he must stop writing. Okay, stop writing, but don't throw stones at me. And this, as you see, it still impressed me. The whole absurdity of this, you know, okay, we brought him, we trust him, you know, we know he's not going to tell any security secrets, so he stops throwing stones at me, and fortunately the journalist stopped taking notes. Just an anecdote of what was the mood at that time. But believe me, the body bags, I couldn't take away the body bags. While people were saying, yes, Iraqis were. And I was thinking about the body bags and what would be the human cost of our actual contribution. So, as you know, in fact, the air campaign had been so efficient that the Iraqi army was totally disorganized, but more important, there was always, and for that, it has been, if I may say, the red thread to all my studies and now publications, when people were thinking that Saddam was the leader of a state called Iraq, for me it was very clear that Saddam was the leader of a gang or regime called the Saddam's clique, and that for him, his army was dispendable. What was important was the presidential command, and now to protect the regime. The same way, by the way, Assad abandoned the Golan in 1967 because he brought all the special forces around Damascus to protect his own regime from a potential coup. So that was exactly the case. So that means that the best trained forces were off the front. They were in Baghdad protecting Saddam and Tikrit and in other places. So they were not there. And that means that during this air campaign, the Iraqi army had felt deeply, concretely abandoned by its own commander-in-chief. So, of course, the bombing had a devastating effect, but on the morale of any army, the fact that they were left alone was also devastating. So it was not an easy walk, it was a war. But this war, that, as you know better than me, was waged and won in 100 hours. So this is a world record of victory. The 6-day war was longer than that. Implied many casualties. So what happened with the French is that since we were expecting not only fierce resistance, but possible heavy losses. So the push was very strong, and fortunately, the enemy was not there to fight. Most of them surrendered very quickly. So the French, also one of our national peculiarity, went on very deep inside, very deep inside. The target was the Salman military airport and the base, and most of the enemy surrendered or were neutralized from the Iraqi army 45th Division. So we had nearly 3,000 war prisoners, and of course all the tanks, all the armaments that you can imagine, with 10 casualties on the French side. But I remember the furious call by the Americans, "Come back now! You are too far!" Believe me, Saddam could have fallen. And it was a decision to keep him in power, or to let him in power. Because at the same time, so we withdrew because we were part of the coalition, and we had, as I told you, military, US military under our command. So it was absolutely excluded to force them to do something that was not part of the coalition plan. But as you know, also better than me, why the Iraqis, why Saddam signed the ceasefire so quickly, it was because he wanted to use the bulk of his forces against his main enemy, the Iraqi people. And the Intifada, the uprising starting very soon on March 2nd, okay, you have all those debates about how it was triggered by the fact that leaflets had been launched saying you should rebel against your tyrant and so on and so forth. What is sure is that it was the whole south rebelled, most of the Iraqi provinces fell under revolutionary control, but thanks to this ceasefire and the fact that Saddam could focus on his own people, the repression was bloody, and the debate would never be settled about the fact of the possible use of chemical weapons against his own people. The Americans claimed it never occurred because it would have been a clear breach of the ceasefire. But what is sure is that helicopters were used against the Iraqi population, which was also a breach of the ceasefire. So you know all this. But what was crucial from the French point of view is that now that Kuwait was liberated, diplomacy should regain its priority. And so, on March 3rd, François Mitterrand called for the Security Council to meet at the head of state level in order to organize a peace conference that would open the way for a Palestinian state. And you know probably that François Mitterrand was formerly a lawyer, so he knows everything about law, and he said very clearly a double standard that would be killing international law. Quote unquote. And on that same day, Pierre Joxe said that what is true for Kuwait should be true for the Palestinians and for Lebanon. So you know perfectly that this didn't happen, but François Mitterrand insisted on Pierre Joxe to come to liberated Kuwait as soon as possible. And so I had the privilege to accompany him on March 16. So you imagine the devastation of the city, and even before landing in the city, the fact that the plane was roaming around the hallways that were burning, it was really an apocalyptic scene. And so, of course, came. There was a very emotional moment with Kuwait leaders that were already back, but the most important moment was at the French residency, which is why it's so important for me to be here in front of you and in front of the French ambassador who is kind enough to host me at this very French residency, because this very French residency had been occupied by the Iraqis. It had been the casus belli for us to enter the coalition. It was a French territory that the Iraqi had occupied. And I won't give you details about the way they treated this part of France, because you know too bad how bad they could behave when they were occupying any part of your land. So it had been a little bit tedied, but it was still feeling the cost of this occupation and this rape, let's call it clearly. And so there was a ceremony of bringing back the French flag on the French residency that was so emotional. So that will be the end of my little story inside the big story. But of course, you know what happened next. You know that what the French said was not heard or was not followed, that the Palestinians were left in the cold, the Syrian army could stay in Lebanon 15 years more, and that eventually the peace process started in Madrid in October 1999, but this peace remained a process, and we're still looking for this peace to become a reality, and no matter how many states consider that the Palestine issue is obsolete, the Palestine issue remains central in this part of the world. But here, in this dear city of Kuwait, in front of you, excellencies, colleagues and friends, I really wanted to share not only those memories, not only those reflections, but also the fact that now, as Akram Abbas just recalled, we have here this National Library, an exhibition about the 60th anniversary of the bilateral relation, and one crucial moment of those relations was certainly when Iraq occupied part of France in Kuwait, and how France contributed at its level to the liberation of your dear country. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Professor Filiu, for this interesting and exciting lecture in which you presented your memories, your souvenirs, and of course your historical analysis of this crucial moment of the relationship between France and Kuwait. Professor Filiu is going to stay for quite a while for the debate, and maybe as long as you want, of course, maybe 30 minutes or 45 minutes. And we could benefit from his presence with us this evening. So we could ask your questions in English, of course, in French, and even in Arabic if you want. So we could open the debate, of course.
Thank you very much, Monsieur Jean-Pierre Filiu.
Thank you so much.
You are a very engaging speaker. I learned a lot. You spoke about liberation Kuwait, the role of France. That's great. I want to emphasize and reiterate and confirm that Kuwait, like other Gulf states, will need France, will need the friendship of the European Union and the allies and the strategic partners. You are aware that like Kuwait and other Gulf states, their goodwill is bigger than their muscles. They find, and they think, and they plan that the muscles are not just indigenous, but international. And they have the support, global support.
and mainly antique European and strategic partners. I remember very well the first invitation I got as in my capacity as Secretary of the GCC in 1982 was from Mr. Chisson, the then French foreign minister. And I went, spent 2 days in France. It reflected the French interest in the Gulf Operating Council. And the French search for the secrets and the philosophy and the objective and the aims of the Gulf Operating Council. You, Sir John, you are aware that France is new to the Gulf. What is needed is more knowledge, vibrant of Gulf heritage, and the Gulf amazing wonders, the land, what we call the historical legitimacy, and the people are one. This amazing wonder is inseparable. And it's a major really, and a main fountain of force and the strength of this region. When Kuwait was occupied, they look around in the region, the Iraqis and others, thinking that there would be some whistling in this region. And there was nothing. So that's dedication to the sanctity of the political and historical legitimacy. I refer to this because I remember we were in the United Nations. I was listening to Mr. Mitterrand, and they went. Now, Mr. Mitterrand, in his long speech, very favorable to Kuwait and for the liberation of Kuwait, touched on what he thought that maybe a cleavage or a distance between what he called the family or the legitimacy of Kuwait and the people. And then that stirred up a lot of anxiety and questions and definitely letters and volumes of contacts and plane and telephones just were all dedicated to find out what's the need, what was made for Mitterrand when he talked about this cleavage, and you talked about the speech of Mr. Mitterrand, which I remember, and I always thought that, well, this is French fascination in the will and of the people and the self-determination. So I really like to see more people like you come here, absorb, watch, investigate, interrogate what goes on and the goodwill of people and the philosophy and the nature and the roots of this area and the roots of this indivisibility with the people and the authority. And this is strength. Last point, the Kuwait has a lot really to be proud of. And this is also one of the requests that people like you would convey that the asset of Kuwait, the humaneness, the openness, the light, constitutional behavior, and all the decency, the dedication, the patience, the tolerance, and the generosity, and the participation with another GCC countries in the program of development, in the developing countries, and also to the institutions, international institutions, be it UN or the the World Bank or local regional funds. So you are welcome, and I hope you will go, and with you, your bag is full of what we call the line of attractiveness of food. Thank you.
Thank you so much, and thank you for this message. You know, professor at Sciences Po at the Paris School of International Affairs, that my good friend Hassan Salameh founded some 10 years ago, with a strong cooperation with KEFAS, with the Kuwaiti Foundation for the Advancement of Sciences. So we are lucky enough to have this long-standing cooperation with Kuwait through the KEFAS. And just an indication, when you were talking about the generosity, there is also something called intellectual generosity. And it is through not only KEFAS, but KEFAS was part of it, that we organized in Paris in 2014 an international conference, but mainly with Arab scholars, about what we call the revolutionary moment. We didn't want to call it Arab Spring. And we made it a book with my colleague, we edited a book with my colleague Stéphane Lacroix, reflection on the revolutionary moment, thanks to this support. And you can imagine that this was not absolutely mainstream. And so the basic principle of academic freedom, that occasion, but we know it's not unique, were at the roots of this intellectual behavior, and we went on that way with our Kuwaiti friends with great success.
Thank you, Professor Jean-Pierre, for this beautiful lecture. You go back to very in the 90s. At that time, he was a young diplomat. At that time, I know Ustad Abdullah Bshara was the General Secretary of the GCC. I still remember his speech in the TV in that time. So beautiful that how you asked this lecture. I heard that the intelligence of France, they sent people to Kuwait, mentioned that the Iraq will invade Kuwait in that day, and there is Tariq, أعتقد وسام مطلع Tariq Rzouki. In that time, he has this letter, and he mentioned that the French intelligence sent the people to Kuwait, the Iraqi will attack Kuwait. Do you know about this? Also, you talk about what happened that time, and Kuwait is still remember France around that time. We talk about, we spoke today earlier morning, why we liberate Kuwait only for the royal family at that time? Why? What the reason behind France to mention this? And what the reaction of France about Mu'tamar Jidda at that time in Kuwait? And where is for this? Also, you mentioned Jean-Luc, he was the Prime Minister of France, yeah? At that time? Jean-Luc?
Jean-Pierre Filiu.
Okay. And he mentioned that there is try to put the Kuwait invasion with the Palestinian problem. You are a historian, you are diplomatic, you know what will happen if the Palestinian issue with the Kuwait will never solve at that time. Why the French Foreign Minister mentioned that?
Roland Dumas, sorry. No, okay. So, first thing, I know all this looks vintage, but Mitterrand was a socialist. At that time, leftist value meant a lot. And in order, people were not aware in France, and especially in the leftist circles, of the differences inside the GCC. That there was a constitution in Kuwait, and that there was not exactly the same system in other monarchies. So it was very important for Mitterrand to convey, because he was always speaking for the domestic and for the international arena at the same time. He didn't try to send messages only outside or messages only inside. It was very important to recall that it was not for the sake of the emir, but it was for the sake of the Kuwaiti population. There was nothing more but nothing less than that. And you know how much it was important, because the Saudi case was, of course, totally different, which is why we had our, let's say, reservation about it. About Roland Dumas, and you know, at that time, you have to remember, now it's over, but during 30 years we lived in US only Middle East. Okay, let's call it bluntly, US only Middle East. And every time somebody is trying to do something else, the Americans would, to be nice, tap him on the head. But in 2003, it was much more than being slapped on the head when we say that
there is no American audience.
No, but it's not the question.
Please continue.
No, it's not the question. I taught at Columbia, I taught at Georgetown. I say that to my American friends. And when the French opposed the Iraqi invasion of 2003, we say it will be a disaster for you, not only for but they didn't listen to our warning. So I was not aware, by the way, about the memo you mentioned. As a historian, I never had it in my hand. I'm not aware about that, so I cannot confirm nor deny. What happened is that at that time, in 1990, the main issue was the Palestinian Intifada, because unfortunately Assad had settled the Lebanese issue by liquidating the Lebanese resistance and forcing Michel Aouni to exile. So the idea that an international conference should be conveyed about the Palestinian issue was really a common aspiration. And so the Minister of Foreign Affairs was considering that the only way for the Americans to accept the international conference was for France, as a permanent member of the Security Council, to endorse the resolution 678. This is a kind of tit for tat that is usual in diplomacy. But as I told you, as a very junior diplomat, very early on, I said no, because now that they pocketed our vote, it's over. You know, that it will be an American-only peace process, which was exactly the case, because in the New World Order of Bush father was far more strategic than his son, was based on two pillars: the military force and the diplomatic talent. And James Baker, the US diplomats, were extremely talented. I insist, I respect them fully, but as representative of US interests, who cannot be equated with the interests of the Middle Eastern people or with the interests of the European people. And were certainly not being equated with the UN Security Council when it comes to the Israeli-Arab conflict. So what we saw is that the only peace treaties that were signed at that time, if you want, we could even speak about more recent ones, were negotiated directly between Jordan and Israel in 1994, and the Oslo Peace Accords were negotiated directly between the PLO and Israel. There was no US mediation. The only US mediation was between Israel and Syria, and it failed lamentably at the Geneva summit between Clinton and Assad at that time. So there was a process, but there was no peace. And there was certainly no peace being delivered. Nothing to be compared. If you compare the two Camp David summits, the one of 1978, which developed into the first Israeli-Arab peace treaty of Camp David, the so-called Camp David treaty, and the Camp David summit of 2000, that couldn't avoid the second intifada and the total collapse of the peace process, you see that there is a downgrading of this capability of engineering peace, not only to wage war. And of course, at that time, America could only win war. But we saw during the last 30 years how America started to be focused more on wars and on peace, was not able to deliver peace, and what inevitably, at the end of the day, it even lost a war in Afghanistan, the conditions that we all know. Because a power cannot be only a military power. This is something that Mr. Putin is learning the hard way in Ukraine. You have to have the other dimension of power. Soft power, cultural power, and you have to have a vision. And believe me, I was in contact with my American counterparts on a daily basis in terms of that now. They had a vision. They had a very clear vision. They had a strategy. It was not you're with me, you're not with me, if you're not with me, you're not. No. It was elaborate, it was, but they were very, very brutal when it came to people who were not following their lines, because they had this coherence. This coherence was going somewhere, but it's somewhere, I'm sorry to say, was not peace in the Middle East, as we understand, as a comprehensive peace. At that time, all this seems really vintage. The motto of the international community was an international conference, and the sponsorship of the UN to reach a comprehensive peace in the Middle East, which is exactly the contrary of what was eventually processed and frustratingly not achieved.
Merci. Voulez-vous que je vous pose la question, mes questions en français ou en breton? Plutôt en anglais parce que, we have now listened to intervention and question by our friends and colleagues here. First of all, I want to indicate that we in Kuwait are and shall remain very grateful for the participation of France in the liberation of Kuwait. This is for us a very clear point. It would have been, naturally it couldn't be, it would have been a big flaw within the coalition if a country like France hadn't joined, naturally. Member of the Security Council, a main power, an important member of the international family, and this is the right word. Having said this, I want to make a remark which should not be interpreted as any detraction of the value and importance of the French position and participation. It's only my kind of remark. And I think it is exactly what Ambassador Bashara indicated. It is nothing that we can blame France for. It is a historical fact that France, or the French, do not know the region compared with other countries which had a presence here in different ways, political, economic, historical presence, especially the British. They know the region, of course, more, and it's a historical reason for nobody is to blame. Now, I want to indicate that we were actually, at that time, I was Ambassador of Kuwait in Latin America, in Brazil. And we were worried in the beginning of the position which France may take. We know that France is a country which is governed by a system, not persons, but still, under the French Constitution, the president has a major role. And until that position really was firm and solid, I, for one, felt sometimes, to be frank, worried that Saddam Hussein may exploit any remarks said in France by politicians. For him, the question of merely talking about possible schism between the Kuwaiti people and the regime, which in fact never existed and doesn't exist. That would have played at the hands of Saddam Hussein, because he invaded Kuwait exactly in the beginning under the pretext of supporting a military and political movement by the opposition against the royal family and the regime. So this would have supported his lie. The other position which Saddam Hussein, of course, was happy at was the resignation of the French defense minister. For him, there was, or he thought, there was a divergence or a schism within the position of France, within the major politicians and leaders of the country. The last point is that nobody is against the fair solution for the Palestinian question. What we are against, and we were warning against during the occupation period, which people here unfortunately call invasion, mistakenly, was that we were warning from any linkage between the Kuwaiti case and the Palestinian case. They are both just and fair, but they are different. Linkage was what Saddam Hussein wanted, exactly. This was one of his political games and inventions to delay any liberation of Kuwait, to disrupt the coalition. At the risk of speaking longer, I want to refer to what you touched upon the liberation of Kuwait, why the coalition stopped short of removing Saddam Hussein. And if I'm mistaken, I hear you say that they wanted to keep Saddam Hussein. I wouldn't go as far as that. If you hear, President Bush's father was asked precisely about this. All of us were confronted as Kuwaiti diplomats, me for one, I for one, about this question, and we asked our American friends, although we had an idea why they stopped. And the good thing was that President Bush eventually answered the question. You know that vicious or malicious Arab politicians like Arafat were repeating that the main aim of the coalition was not the liberation of Kuwait, but was to interfere in the Iraqi affairs and to remove the regime. Another thing, members, or at least one member of the coalition, Syrian, was threatening that if the coalition marched upon Iraq, they would withdraw. That would have also put the cohesion and unity of the coalition at risk. A third factor was that the UN resolutions authorized the international coalition, Kuwait and the collaborating friendly countries to liberate Kuwait. It did not authorize them to overrun Iraq or to change the regime in Iraq. So, if that had happened, much to our distress as Kuwaitis, of course, nobody would have been happier than seeing Saddam Hussein removed at the end of the war to liberate Kuwait, especially that it was an easy march to Iraq. But exactly Bush or Mr. Bush or the coalition would have been accused of violating the UN resolutions. What we were, of course, blaming Saddam Hussein for doing. So the coalition would have made the same mistake. These were all, I think, considerations why President Bush's father stopped Major Colonel Schwarzkopf from marching upon Iraq, which he wanted very much to do, as we all know. So I have only this. Now, a final question, which is not very diplomatic, but I'm not a diplomat, I'm retired now. So, so j'ose pose la question. If it's a theoretical question, if there was Mr. Jacques Chirac at that moment, at the presidency in France, who was a Gaullist, rather than Mr. Mitterrand, do you think that the position of Iraq, of France, would have changed? As we know, of course, Mr. Chirac was a personal friend of Saddam Hussein. He even wrote to him that he liked the way that Saddam Hussein's mother prepared maskouf, which is the typical fish in Iraq. Of course, Mitterrand was a socialist and this was a Gaullist, but still the personal inclination here would have played a part or not. Do you think that if Chirac was the president, the position of France would have been the same or different? Jean-Pierre.
Thank you so much. I will start by the last question because it's a non-question, especially for a historian, because Chirac became president 5 years later, so nobody knows what would have happened in a different context. When Mitterrand was at that time in charge for nearly 10 years with all the aura, and so it's not because there is no answer to be given to this kind of question. But I'm sorry to say that I beg to differ absolutely with your kind whitewashing of Bush betrayal of the Iraqi people. Because there was absolutely no reason to violate UN resolution. When Turkey, as a southern pillar of NATO, faced a massive Kurdish exodus because of the repression of the same intifada in the north, not only were we able to pass very quickly Resolution 688, the so-called responsibility to protect, but we were able, with your British friends and our American friends, to establish a no-fly zone in 24 hours. There would have been a no-fly zone in the south, Saddam was doomed. Because without helicopters, he couldn't quell the uprising in Najaf, Kerbela, and Basra. So I'm always surprised when people believe that toppling a dictator is marching through a country. And probably because our French history, with all the debt we have to our American friends in ending the Nazi occupation and the rule of Vichy. But at the end of the day, it was also a contribution of the French people. So the idea that you can only be liberated by the army rolling in, a foreign army rolling in, I can tell you, the Iraqis were ready to liberate by themselves. But they couldn't do it when they were bombed by helicopters and in such a ruthless way. And as you know, there were far more casualties in this repression than during the whole Desert Shield, Desert Storm period, except we will never know how much because of the opacity of the Saddam regime and the brutality of this repression. So the idea that, and to add on top of that, and for a diplomat, so I don't have to say who told me that it was very clear from the American, now that Saddam is in the box, quote unquote, we can handle the region. Because we had also this idea that we cannot trust the Iraqi people. The Iraqi people, if they are Shia or they are pro-Iranian. You all know, especially in Kuwait, that this identification between some trend of Islam and political international affiliation is absolutely wrong. But there was this idea that, oh yes, we cannot do that. And to end on a more rosy note, a more Hollywoodian note, I don't like George Clooney that much, but I love, the Three Kings movie. And in the Three Kings, who, by the way, was shot in the desert of Arizona, it's very clear, even at the level of those three soldiers who are inside of Iraq, that you needed to do that, and the system would have collapsed. But it was made very clear after the ceasefire that you can go on with your dirty business. We won't interfere. And since you mentioned Palestine, to make this short answer comprehensive, 2 months ago I was in Palestine, I was in occupied East Jerusalem, and while, the Palestinians, of course, were saying, double standards, Ukraine, double standards, I fully agree with you, double standard, double standard. But listen, when you Palestinians, you supported the occupation and annexation of a sovereign Arab country that, by the way, was the cradle of Fatah. You didn't realize that you were literally shooting yourself in the foot. I'm not even talking about moral, about international law. And I told him, and you imagine the discussion, and I have no, one has to be frank with his friends, the same way I'm very explicit with you because of our friendship. And I told them, international principles are to be protected and cherished by an oppressed people even more than by the other. And the strategic mistake that Arafat and the Palestinian leadership did by siding with Saddam and by supporting this absolute violation of international law, in my view, was a tremendous blow against the Palestinian cause. And we could discuss that, but just for you to be convinced if there was any doubt that, what I say here, I say it with a Palestinian audience, and I said that I wrote it in Le Monde, on black and white, and so there is absolutely no doubt.
Yes, I very much appreciated the presentation. And one of the things I liked most was your insistence on addressing the unfinished jobs in the Middle East as well as what has been accomplished. So you touched upon the controversy of Lebanon and Palestine, and you elaborated on that. So you talked both like as a historian and as a diplomat, and my question appeals more to the historian in you actually. And I would like to ponder a little bit about the reasons that have led historically to what happened with the invasion in Kuwait, and to be more specific about the kind of relationship that the West entertains with Middle Eastern dictators, to be very specific. Now, I understand that by virtue of our human conditions, we are full of complexities. And there is not only one West, there are several Wests. There is the economic West, and there is the human values West, there is the secular West, what have you. So, when my background is actually, I'm not a diplomat, I'm more into economy. And the way I like to see the world as a better world is as a simple triangle made of rights at one point, at the other, or democracy, whatever you might call it. At the other point, I like to look at sustainable economy, and then I'd like to look at strong institutions. after the, or post the liberation of Kuwait, one would have expected more talk in a balanced way by the West on the three fronts of that triangle. Unfortunately, one has witnessed a sudden drop in all that, and we're actually seeing a ferocious competition on the material and economic part of the triangle, and we kind of stopped seeing or hearing any rhetoric on democracy or even stronger institutions, which is even more complex. I interact with ambassadors sometimes, or I follow their speeches and discourses, and I witness, I'm talking about Western ambassadors, they stop talking about things like rights and institutional capacity, and many of them have drifted into competition towards economy and open markets. So, is there a comment you can make on that? Thank you.
Well, that would need another lecture and far more capacities than the modest one I have. So I'll just make one comment to answer to this existential issue. And sorry also to mention my own experience, because, you know, when I was this junior diplomat next to this big Minister of Defense, there was a liberation of Kuwait, but then there was a collapse of the Soviet Union. And then there was France becoming the first contributor to the UN peacekeeping forces. You know, at that time we had crisis, let's say, on a weekly basis, literally. And certainly what occurred, all those possibilities, all those hopes, was not fulfilled, but we avoided a lot of catastrophes. You know, everybody now is recalling that Russia is a nuclear power, but remember that the collapse of the Soviet Union, technically Ukraine was a nuclear power, and we managed to avoid tensions about that. So certainly we should all hope and dream for leaders and people to stick to values that are common values, universal values, which is why I was recalling my commitment with International Federation of Human Rights. There is no cultural differences about human values. You know, torture is hurting anybody, from the west or the east, from the north or the south. There's no distinction about that. And the whole idea that there is those cultural bridges doesn't work. But, and it's just a comment, certainly not an answer. Why is Ukraine resisting so bravely to Russia? Not because at the end of the day it has a stronger army, but because it has stronger values. And they are, you know, echoing the fact that you have a people's army that is now fighting for a country, the values, the republic they consider their own. And at the end of the day, that proves that sheer force cannot deliver anything. That if you don't have those values, if you don't have this commitment, if you don't have this cohesion in a society around those shared values, then you can be defeated easily. And what is Ukraine proving, I think, is exactly the contrary. And that is also an opportunity for me to praise their heroic resistance until today.
Yeah, thank you, Professor, for your conference, and welcome again to Kuwait. My question in French language. Merci beaucoup pour la conférence, et au-delà de ce discours un peu émotif, car quand vous avez évoqué, à vrai dire, Saddam Hussein, Tariq Aziz, pour nous, les Koweïtiens, ça nous fait un peu le frisson, à vrai dire. Mais au-delà de ce discours, oui, voilà, parce que nous l'avons vécu réellement, alors que vous avez un regard externe. Alors, au-delà de ce discours émotif, j'ai deux questions, ou plutôt deux remarques. quel enseignement on peut tirer de cette guerre terrible en ce qui concerne le développement, j'allais dire, économique, politique actuel du pays ici au Koweït? Quel regard vous donnerez pour le développement actuel maintenant au Koweït? Deuxième remarque, j'ai vu que vous avez publié beaucoup de bouquins. Donc là, c'est une contribution, j'allais dire, livresque. J'aimerais que ça soit un peu sur le terrain, un travail de coopération de terrain, en partenariat, en coopération avec l'Université du Koweït, et j'allais dire même pour le ministère de l'Éducation, car je crois que l'opération militaire d'Agué n'est pas évoquée dans le manuel. Donc nous, les Koweïtiens, on ne connaît pas cette opération. Et puis, tous les détails que vous avez évoqués, ou les souvenirs que vous avez mentionnés dans la conférence, je crois même les gens, étudiants, les étudiants du département de géographie à la fac, que ce soit l'Université du Koweït ou l'autre faculté, ne connaissent pas ces détails-là. Maintenant, est-ce qu'il y a une raison de cela? Donc, j'aimerais vous, en tant qu'historien, prof, vous aviez contribué à ça, il faut que ça soit voilà, un travail de terrain universitaire, académique, comme ça, nous, les étudiants, pas les étudiants, nos étudiants, voilà, parce que je suis enseignant, prof, nos étudiants savent ça et peuvent le comprendre, je ne dirais pas émotivement, mais rationnellement, pour en tirer le résultat que nous souhaitons. Voilà, merci beaucoup.
So thank you so much for your questions. Thank you for using French in such a talented and impeccable way. And sorry to answer you in English because that's the rules of the games that were chosen. I can only tell you that I hope, of course, I'm emotional. You know, I teach my students. Don't be afraid of your emotions. Emotions can be a tool towards learning and acquiring knowledge. This idea that you have to be absolutely cold or oblivious to your emotions in order to reach a higher level of knowledge, I don't buy that at all. I think empathy is often key, so I don't make a contradiction between one and the other. And when it comes to your very kind proposal, well, I turn to the representative of France here. I'm sure that it could be a field of cooperation, but I insist on the fact that I was a very junior member of a big machine called the French Republic, and I just used these opportunities that Makram Abbas kindly offered me to echo one with the other, to have, as is put here, you know, these personal memories echoing historian reflection. And obviously, you know, I'm only one person, so what I brought and learned from this personal experience obviously contributed to what I write and present today here in Kuwait, tomorrow in other places, or back in front of my students. But as you understood perfectly, it's not to say, yes, France did that. You know, I mentioned the limits, even the shortcomings of our position, who were power among others. But what I think should be conveyed is the fact that the French position was very coherent, and that unfortunately, in this part of the world, very often the French say, "On vous l'avait bien dit." We told you before. And we told to Bushfather, if you don't really, not just send an invitation to a conference in Madrid or I don't know where, but if you don't really address the Palestinian issue, it's going to be a problem. And we told Bush Jr., if you really go into Iraq under those circumstances, of course you'll win. Of course you'll win. But the day after will be terrible. So, honestly, we would love to be wrong when we say this kind of thing. But history proved that we were not entirely wrong, to put it mildly.
Thank you. Maybe last question?
Thank you for this interesting testimony. My question was more technical about when you said you volunteered, or the person who was sent there was not on the Kuwaiti list or not on the Iraqi list, or about also the president of the Commission of Foreign Affairs in Parliament, that he was sent. All of this is like the diplomatic channels as unofficial, or it was an official, because you told it was like casus belli, so there was already at war with Iraq. But those people were sent after maybe the hostages were taken. So they were like, how do you say, sondé l'ennemi, or more like...
You know, about technicalities, one can say anything about French diplomacy, but we are very good about technicalities. So, to be very concrete, the decision to send a volunteer diplomat, because nobody could be ordered to do that, to Kuwait, was taken before the storming of our residency. It was in August, late August, after the beginning of the hostage crisis. And it was because like that, because our diplomats were in occupied Kuwait, could not deal with the occupation authorities, otherwise they would have been acknowledging the occupation one way or another. And our diplomats based in Baghdad could not go to Kuwait because that would be also acknowledging the Iraqi occupation. So the trick from the international legal point of view was to send somebody directly from France. But at the end of the day, the Iraqis themselves, for the reason I mentioned, decided not so I have this visa that is cancelled by the same Iraqi authorities that granted it. And when it comes to Vosel, this is a classical distinction between parliamentary power and executive. We have the division of power in France. So of course, you know, everybody knew that Vosel was very close to Mitterrand. But he was not a member of the government, even a junior member. So in no way we are acknowledging the fait accompli of the occupation. So we didn't want to open a back channel. It was the parliament through the president of the Foreign Affairs Commission that was going to Kuwait. So formally, the executive power was not committed since we were with Soudagé in a potential war situation that, by the way, became an open war 10 days later. But that is just, you know, what we're supposed to do, because saying, oh, peace is better than war, well, you know, peace, what I say to all my students who say, oh yes, we want to contribute to peace, you know, peace is very exhausting. I knew the Norwegian minister that monitored the Oslo Peace Accords. The guy was a champion of ski. He died of an heart attack 2 years later. Peace is exhausting. Peace is exhausting. It's much easier to say, yes, you are an enemy, I fight you, boom, boom, boom. No, peace, because you have to do this, you have to do that, you have to go into the gray zone, you have to come back, you know. But we were committed until the very last day to try to find a peaceful solution. We knew that we had one chance out of 100, 1,000, but still Mitterrand wanted to explore this path without, and I insist, conceding anything to Saddam. Anything. And I think I didn't mention it, you know, the first thing that Tariq Aziz said to Michel Vosel, why didn't my friend Roland Dumas write me? My counterpart. But that would have been a recognition, Minister of Foreign Affairs speaking to Minister of Foreign Affairs, and we didn't want to do that. The people who did that was James Baker with Tariq Aziz 4 days later, but the French didn't want to go that way because of this division of power. I hope I was clear enough. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Filiu, for this very interesting and exciting presentation. I would like also to thank the audience for the high quality of questions. I think we succeeded in raising a kind of historical debate about this crucial moment of the French-Kuwaiti relationships. For me, as a director of a research center, the objective is reached. So I will seize the opportunity to give some announcement. We will have on the 25th of May another presentation on France and the religion of Islam. It will be in the Kuwaiti Writers League. And at the end of the month also, we will have the opening of an exciting exhibition about the French-Kuwaiti relationship since the 18th century. So see you soon, and thank you so much.